I'm so glad that you are with us this morning as we continue our series, Fake News, because we are all experiencing all kinds of fake news in the media today, in each and everything we turn to on social media, on the news, on television, on whatever it is. It seems like we are trying to discern, is this real or is this fake? Is this true or is this fake news? Is this actually happening or is this just rhetoric that somebody is espousing? And it's hard to know sometimes. It's hard to know what's true, what's not true, and what is actually happening or not happening. In fact, I think this has infected the church in all kinds of ways, and there's all kinds of things that we have to ask ourselves, what is the truth? Is what's really happening? And so as we're walking through this series, we're talking about the things that our friends have questions about. Real things, real issues that are happening in the world around us, things that we face ourselves, that we struggle with, we sometimes don't have the answers for. And I think this week, this question is one of those ones that we don't have a great answer for, because there is no good answer on this one. This is not one of the ones that'll be able to wrap up in a nice little bow and perfectly answer for you this morning. It's not one of those ones that at the end of the message you're going to be fully satisfied and feel like, hey, Chris was Bible answer man today. He had all the answers that I needed around this issue. This issue is so very complicated and has just put a smear across the reputation of the church in North America, but globally, around the failure of those in ministry. There is no perfect pastor. That's fake news. And yet, the expectation of pastors, the expectation of those who stand in the pulpit, of clergy, of priests across the globe, is that they live on a pedestal that cannot be knocked down, that has to be elevated and held to an account on a level that no human being is capable of living up to. And yet there's a tension to be had. There's a tension between grace and accountability. There's a tension when you're in leadership to be accountable for the position in which you hold, and yet there is grace from Jesus and hopefully the church. And yet there is grace, but there's also reconciliation and accountability in the position that people hold. And this issue has hurt a lot of us. And I say a lot of us because my family is included in that story of church hurt because of the failure of those in ministry. Pastors falling from the pedestal we put them on is incredibly painful for the church. As a young child, my family attended a church, and my mom caught the minister cheating on his wife on our street. The church said it was okay. They said, that's fine, we're all sinners. That was the response of the church. And then it started to come out that it wasn't with just one woman in the church, but multiple women in the church. And then some of their husbands started saying, maybe it's not okay, because it's my wife. Interesting. So we want to justify other people's sin until it affects us. We want to say it's okay unless it hurts us, as if sin doesn't affect other people, as if it doesn't hurt other people. And it's not okay. It's not okay. And through the years, and as I came to follow Christ later in life because of that and really walking away from the church, There was a time where I struggled with understanding what this looked like, and I've watched pastors fail over and over again. And I know some of you that are a part of this church are a part of this church where you left and then found out just weeks after you arrived at this church that there was a massive, major moral failure by the leadership of your church. And not just one pastor, but multiple pastors in that church. I know for me, in the first church I went into ministry, my boss left ministry because the pastor that called him into ministry slept with his secretary. And he thought, maybe my call isn't real. The whole reason I went into ministry was because this person laid hands on me and told me that I was called into ministry. And so clearly that person wasn't anointed and called by God because of their failure, because of their humanity. And yet as we look around, we see the devastation, even in the Catholic Church, of what it's caused around failure. And there's accountability for that. Jesus said, it is better for a millstone to be tied around your neck and for you to be thrown into the sea than for you to hurt a child. So that is definitely something that has to be held accountable for. There is an accountability that has to be held. And yet there's this tension in the church of the mercy and grace of Jesus and the accountability of positions that people hold, but also for all of us in our journey with God. Because it's fake news to say that any pastor is perfect. And that includes me, and shockingly, it includes Bettina and Eden. And Shayla reminds us every week that it includes her. So we all know it includes her. But people will often say to me, the speaker I was listening to on TV fell morally with money, sex, drugs, power, whatever it was. Or the pastor in my old church. I was counseling a young woman recently who was abused by her pastor. And I know that's a story for some of you in this church. My pastor has changed his or her opinion on the Bible or rejected his or her faith altogether. What do I do with that? Does that mean that everything they taught and did are now null and void? That's one of the questions that people ask. Does it mean that everything that they taught, should we take down all the material off the internet that they ever taught because clearly it's false, it's wrong, it's untrue? Do I need to get rebaptized or remarried or whatever? Because the pastor that married us, the pastor that baptized me, the pastor that whatever was significant for you has fallen morally. What do we do with that? Should I stop giving to the church because clearly this system is broken? Yeah, it's broken. It's broken in all kinds of ways, but that's not why we give. Do I need to get a new Bible because their commentary is in mine? That all of the notes that are actually in the bottom of my Bible are from this particular leader who's fallen. Because the pedestal was big, and when it got knocked down, it's destroyed my understanding of faith. I mean, these are legitimate questions, I think. These are real struggles, and I'm sure you can come up with other questions on your own. I don't have time to go through all the ones that we probably have around some of these issues. But why does it get so bad for some leaders that they fall? How does this even take place? How do we get to a place that somebody had got built up so much that when they fall, our view is that it's wrecking our faith? But why did they go there? Here are just some reasons leaders fall when I meet with groups of pastors and talk about this issue. First of all, people are people. Doing people-y things. And that includes pastors. Temptation is real for all, and I actually think that those who are in leadership, the devil wants to slow down the church, and he picks on them. I remember when Carson Pugh, the head of Arrow Ministry, said, "You've got a bummer of a birthmark." He said, because the call of God is on your life, there's a birthmark on you that you can't do anything about. You have to fulfill, and yet the devil wants to destroy you because of it. There's burnout and self-sabotage because the expectations on leaders is that you can publicly speak, you can care for every person that has a need, you can run finances, you can do real estate and understand everything about buildings and facilities and sound and lights. You have the ability to lead perfectly without ever messing up relationally with anybody. You can run a volunteer organization, you can run a charity. You can meet every need that every person has, even though they're not communicated. And so burnout and self-sabotage become a thing for many leaders. Unhealthy coping mechanisms come to play, that they begin to no longer turn to Jesus, but to other things to cope. There's unhealthy power structures that are actually set up in the way that we formulate the church, particularly in North America, that allows for this, that creates the elevation of leadership in a way that's unhealthy. And then there's no real accountability in many cases. And church leaders began to think things like, no one will know. Or everybody already knows, so what does it matter? What I'm doing isn't hurting anyone. I can't tell anyone. I will lose everything if people find out. I can control it. No one will understand. This will affect so many people if I tell the truth, so I won't. The secret is easier. These are the kinds of lies that as I sit down with friends who are in ministry and struggling with different patterns of sin in their life, that they're trying to work through, that they feel they have no safe place to go. But we set up structures and systems in such a way that if they tell the truth, they feel like they'll lose their job, which in some cases they should. And in other cases, they need forgiveness and reconciliation and support to work through those things. But the real lie behind this is that our personal sin doesn't affect anyone else. And I believe that's a lie that all of us in the church can believe. You don't have to be in leadership in the church to actually believe that. In fact, as parents, you can believe that. As aunts and uncles, you can think that your position as an aunt or uncle over somebody else's kids, that your sin isn't going to affect them. But I've got a question for you. What sin doesn't create problems for others? Environmental indifference? That doesn't create a problem for anybody, right? A blind eye to injustice? That's not causing a problem for anybody, right? Gossip? No problem for anybody. Adultery doesn't affect anybody, right? Murder, addiction, stealing, I don't know. What sin is there that doesn't impact others? They break relationship. Our sin impacts others whether you're in leadership or not. But a leader's sin affects everyone. In Joshua 7, there's a story that some of you might know. It's the story of the walls of Jericho coming tumbling down. There's a Sunday school song that some of you would know about the walls come tumbling down. And God gives Israel victory in Jericho, and there's a certain plunder as spoils of war that were considered devoted things that God didn't want Israel taking for themselves, but burning as a declaration that God defeated Jericho, not them. But it was a direct defiance of a direct order from God to take these things for personal use, and yet some of the leaders did. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. The result, many men died. Israel's army melted in fear. Joshua questioned God. God threatened to withdraw his presence from his people. Just light consequences. Achan and his family were killed. Another one, 2 Samuel 24. David's sin with Bathsheba resulted in constant war under David's rule and the death of their child. So, when people say, David was a big sinner, there were consequences. In the text that we're going to look at this morning, David took a census God asked him not to take. It was a sin of pride and ambition. Taking a census had to do with knowing how many troops you had to go to war, but the land was in a time of peace, and David wasn't meant to do this. But David was wanting to expand his borders without God's permission. He was trying to take more power for himself. He struggled with adultery. He struggled with power. He was a bad dad. There's just all kinds of things in David's life. The story, before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come. This is what the Lord says. I'm giving you 3 options, David. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So God went to David and said to him, shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plagues in your land? I think there's a game today, isn't there? What's the name of the game? Where you get to choose which bad option you want? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. So you've got 3 choices, David. 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies, or 3 days of plague. For the result of your sin, everybody in your land suffers. David saw this as God's mercy, but chose 3 days of plague, and many Israelites die because of David's sin. So there's an accountability in leadership here that's much more severe. 2 Kings 21. Manasseh, king of Israel, practiced all kinds of evil, sorcery, divination, and consulting with mediums and spirits, which was forbidden by the Lord. Worship of Asherah, forbidden by God. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, which could be a problem. And he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. His mother's name was Hezbollah, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Jerusalem was destroyed. Manasseh and many Israelites were killed. Now, today's pastors experience the grace of the cross, but their sin still affects congregations. So we see it in the New Testament as well. Today, leader sin hurts the community as well. The reputation of Christians, not just leaders, right? I mean, it's hard to talk to somebody about the Christian faith and the issues within the Catholic Church not to be brought up. Or the issues of predominant leaders within the Christian church not to be brought up. The impact of the sin on the people it was perpetrated against and their community. You think of our First Nations communities all across Canada and what happened. It rocks the faith and journey of believers who have sat under their teaching. I mean, these things have massive implications today on the church. And that's why James, the brother of Jesus, said this in the New Testament, not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that those who teach will be judged more strictly. That's sober for me. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. Leaders, particularly teachers of God's word, will be judged more harshly for their sins. Because the more you know, the more you're held accountable for. The recognition that we all need the cross is there, though. I love what Billy Graham says, that airplanes take off every day from this airport, but the news only covers the ones that crash. When asked about the failure of others in ministry, that was his response. He said, look, there are pastors and leaders in the church doing a great job across this country and around the world. But the only ones we report and talk about are those that fail. The only things that we tend to talk about are the failures. And yet the New Testament has this balance between grace and accountability. There's a tension. In Paul writing to Timothy, the church had done away with the hierarchical system of the day where no leader was to be called father, as Jesus declared. Now everyone is equal, so who gets to lead? It's like Timothy was asking Paul, how do you choose a leader when everyone is equal? How do you do that in the church? How do you create a system where it's equality of all people, that all people are accountable to one another in an equal system and yet have leadership? And Paul gives Timothy a list of behaviors to qualify a leader. It's not exhaustive or a checklist that alone approves a person. It has a guide for Timothy to choose proven leaders that are good relationally with others for the benefit of the community. And this is what the list says. Above reproach, which means of good reputation, one spouse, because that was a problem. Temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, gentle, not violent, not argumentative, not greedy or in love with money, manages their family well, respected by their kids, not a recent convert, and a good reputation with outsiders. But this isn't supposed to be a list of expectations of perfection in the pulpit. Because when we go there, we set people up to live in a way that's just not possible. And just like in any relationship or any marriage relationship, uncommunicated expectations are unmet expectations. And if you think that he should just know what I'm thinking and what I want in this relationship, or she should just know what I'm thinking or what I want in this relationship, and it's uncommunicated expectations in any relationship are going to be unmet expectations because they're not reasonable. And the same is true in the church with leadership. Shayla will fail you. Eden will fail you. Bettina will fail you. I will fail you lots. That's the reality. The reality is that we're human beings trying our very best. And yet there's a tension that we want to have with you between accountability and grace. That there's an opportunity for you to speak into our lives and to share with us things and to hold us accountable because we're the church. We're a priesthood of believers that are equal before God. And in leadership, we're called to serve one another with a towel as Jesus did in washing the disciples' feet. That's our role as leaders. And yet there's this tension that we need to have. And there's only one perfect leader, and his name is Jesus. I'm so glad you got it right. His name is Jesus. And I'm not him. And neither is Shayla, and neither is Eden, and neither is Bettina. God forgives leaders and everyone else who asks for forgiveness, including you. And I'm sorry that we will let you down at times. And if your expectations aren't communicated, you're definitely going to be let down. And if you don't call and let us know that you're in the hospital, you're definitely not going to get a visit because we don't know. And if you don't let us know that you're struggling and going through something, we can't meet that need. And don't expect that because you told somebody else that somebody else was going to tell me. Because that's not how that works. That's actually gossip. So them not telling me was actually maybe the right thing to do. You have to communicate with us for us to serve you. The unhealthy response in this is taking a swing at the bride of Christ. We hate spousal abuse, and I actually think that that's what we're doing when we're taking a swing at the bride of Christ, the church, through social media and other means to point out a leader's sin. I hate it when Christians go off on some other leader on the internet. It just smears all of us. Gossiping about the sin of a fallen leader or agreeing with it are both wrong. Turning your back on Jesus because you idolize the leader or worship them instead of Jesus. Who are we following? Hopefully it's Jesus. Letting your faith get wrapped up in someone else's journey, you got to separate that. Getting upset about uncommunicated expectations or unfair expectations. Giving your opinion on something that you don't really know the facts about. Getting angry and being the judge and executioner of a child of God. Saying it's okay or justifying their sin because we're all sinners is equally wrong. Dismissing the implications on others and the community. Dismisses the injustice that's happened to the First Nations people here in Canada. And it's not okay. We have to apologize for that. We have to own the truth of that story as the church. Dismissing the implications on others. Thinking a breach of trust doesn't need to have leadership implications. It does. It absolutely does. A breach of trust needs to have leadership implications. And yet, Jesus also says this to us in Luke 6. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. So there can be a connection between leaders and our following of Christ because we're being mentored and led by people in our lives. But how can the blind lead the blind? But also, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye or your sister's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? I love the way the Message version, it says, how can you get the toothpick out of your brother's eye when you've got a telephone pole in your eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. We're so quick to judge. We all need to have a posture of humility and love and forgiveness. We're prone to think that we're better than the person who's fallen publicly. Well, at least I'm not such and such. At least I'm not this person. I'm not that bad. As we justify our own sin and somehow make it better than someone else's. So there's tension. This is one of those things that doesn't have resolution. That there's grace and accountability. And I would say an understanding of this is important for a healthy response. Choosing not to pass on information that makes the church and Jesus look bad. Praying for our fallen brother or sister in leadership. Talking with a trusted advisor on the issues that affect us personally if need be. Forgiving our brother or sister of their sin, if appropriate, helping to see them come to repentance and providing the support they need. Go directly to them if they sinned against you. Helping the victims of the sin that was perpetrated. Reconciling and helping people more move forward. Recognize that trust being rebuilt requires work on all of our parts. Expect that the cross and the resurrection are possible. Expect that they can actually be forgiven and reconciled and change. Because Christ opened his arms and laid down his life for all of us, pointing us to the posture that we should have towards others when they fail us.